alien came to Earth today and wanted to learn more about humans. Say this alien decided to meet with 100 people, everyday, average, randomly selected people, to find out more about our lives and experiences. Statistically, 4 or 5 of those people would likely be Americans. A few other big countries like Brazil, India, and Indonesia would likely have multiple people selected. Most countries would have 1 or none. But about 20 of those people would be Chinese. That's right, 1 in every 5 people in the world, about 1.4 billion human beings, lives in China. That's more than 4 times as many as the United States. Hi, I'm Francesca Hodges, and I'm here to talk about China's increasingly global presence in the 21st century. In many ways, China's story is at the center of global change over the past 2 decades. 100 years ago, China was a country divided among warlords, occupied by foreign powers, and with much of its population living in poverty. But in the century that followed, it has become the biggest manufacturer in the world, now producing many of the goods used by people everywhere. Have a look at this chart showing the rise of China's gross domestic product per capita, a measure of its economic output per person. This measure of rising production demonstrates China's growth as probably one of the biggest success stories of globalization. Arguably, this growing wealth has had a big impact on the lives of the Chinese people. Here's another pretty revealing chart. It shows the decline in the percentage of China's population living in extreme poverty between 1990 and 2015. That decline, from above 60% of the population to about 3%, represents millions of people raised out of poverty in that 25-year period. But what does all of this change feel like to the Chinese? Has this intense economic growth improved their lives? These are the questions we ask in this video. And for answers, I turn to Dr. Professor Chang. She is a professor in the Global Studies Department at UC Berkeley, where I happen to be a student. Professor Chang, who governs China today?
Today, China is governed by the Chinese Communist Party.
Would you describe this governmental system as democratic, authoritarian, or neither?
I would describe the Chinese political system as authoritarian. When the CCP took control in 1949, they established the People's Republic of China, and it is authoritarian. The party retains full control over all aspects of Chinese political life, considerable influence over the economy, and very close surveillance over China's 1.4 billion people.
Why do the Chinese people support or allow the party to govern?
So let's start with what life was like in the 1970s. This was the Cultural Revolution. This was a time when the country was ravaged by political chaos and social chaos. And at that time, the country was very poor. And after the reforms, China's middle class grew, incomes grew, and people's lives materially got much better. And so I tell you that story because there's sort of an implicit social contract between the Chinese people and the government, which works like this. As long as the government continues to improve people's material livelihoods and provide social stability, the people allow the government to continue to be ruled by the Communist Party. And so as long as that relationship holds, the people are fine with Communist Party rule.
Considering China's massive economic expansion, would you say that China has benefited from globalization?
I would say China has benefited greatly from globalization. At first, it attracted a lot of foreign direct investment because China offered cheap labor and a lot of favorable policies. So a lot of companies from around the world went to produce goods in China. Then as the country became richer, it became a desirable market, right? There were many jokes about what would it be like to sell every Chinese consumer a pencil? And then it was like, what would it be like to sell them a phone? And then what would it be like to sell them a car, right? So China has the largest automobile market in the world today. You might be surprised to learn that General Motors, an American company, sells more cars in China than it does in the United States. So yes, China has been a huge benefactor of globalization. And according to a lot of big surveys, like the Pew Global Attitude Survey, Chinese people are they look on globalization much more favorably than Americans do today.
How does the party maintain unity and popular support?
Good question. So the Chinese government uses old-fashioned propaganda, actually, to maintain a very coherent message. And as a result, they also censor the news and they try to focus in on a very consistent narrative, which is everything good in your life is because of the party. And that's through the education system, through what people watch on television, what they consume on the internet. And there is a lot of censorship on the Chinese internet for any dissent or any opinions that do not fit within that narrative.
You just mentioned that there was dissenting opinion against the Chinese Communist Party. Where does this opposition lie?
Well, Francesca, that's a great question. There really isn't significant opposition. And every time there's a small social movement, it is quashed by the party. We saw this in 1989 with the Tiananmen protests led by students and then workers. We've seen this with other small movements like the Falun Gong, which is a spiritual quasi-religious movement. We've seen this with small Tibetan uprisings and uprisings in Xinjiang. Every time there seems to be a small movement growing, the government quells it pretty substantially.
Referring to one of those social movements, what is happening in Hong Kong as of June 2019?
Yeah, so in Hong Kong, you get a pretty good idea of what happens when citizens challenge the state. Over the last several years, actually, there have been a series of protests. Way back when Hong Kong was returned to China, the original agreement between the British government and the Chinese government was that Hong Kong people would at some point be able to have an election of their chief executive. But unfortunately, the Chinese government has really not honored that decision. And they have implemented now a new national security law, which basically prohibits all people in Hong Kong and in China and even in the rest of the world, the language of it, from getting involved in Hong Kong politics or commenting on Hong Kong politics at all. And they've used this new law to put several of the young leaders in jail. It's really quite sad to see from the outside.
Speaking about a different social movement in a different geographic location, what have Uyghur Muslims been experiencing in recent years?
Yeah, so going back quite a few years now, there have been a few incidents of more radicalized Uyghurs who've acted out against Han Chinese, which is the ethnic majority in China, and that did lead to a few deaths. And in reaction to those isolated incidents, the Chinese government has instituted a very broad campaign to basically what the Chinese would call re-educate Uyghur Muslims. And we know now that over 1 million Uyghur Muslims have been put into labor camps, including women and children.
Dr. Chang seemed to paint two different pictures of the Chinese state, as a force that had improved people's lives, but also as an autocratic, interfering government that forced people to conform. I couldn't figure out whether, overall, life had improved for the Chinese people over the last century. So I asked Dr. Chang a few more questions to get her overall assessment. Professor Chang, would you say that life has improved for the average Chinese citizen over the past few decades?
I would say, without a doubt, for almost all Chinese people, life has improved dramatically over the last century. If we think back to 1911, China was in a tatters, right? The central government had essentially lost control over many parts of the country. Economically, people were not doing well. China's political system was being infringed upon by foreign countries, including the United States. It was soon to be invaded by Japan. So if we compare today's China with that time, most people's lives have dramatically improved. Not only that, but parents today feel confident that the lives of their children will be better than their own lives. That's huge, right? I think in the developed world, that is no longer true in many countries. However, it's still important to note that the government's control and surveillance over society is intensifying, and it is infringing on the lives of people who have dissenting opinions, whether that's in Tibet, Xinjiang, Hong Kong, Taiwan, or some of China's leading universities. In those places, people are worried about their future. At least they're worried about the ability of Chinese people to speak their minds or to give feedback to how their country is governed. That window is closing. So There's no such thing as free speech or freedom to organize in China. For most Chinese, they're okay with that. But for those who want to speak out, things are only going to get more restrictive.
Dr. Chang's answer suggested that, in her analysis, life had improved for the majority of Chinese people under the rule of the Communist Party. The social contract she mentioned earlier, that the people would support the government as long as it improved their lives, was working for most people, but not for everyone. Those who wanted more political freedoms, or to continue their cultural or religious practices, were forced to conform. It's a different system than from the United States, and from most European countries, but because of China's huge population and economic significance, it's an important part of the global picture now, in this era of intense globalization.